Good evening, everyone. My name is Mike Tierney. I teach in the government department, and I'm the director at the Global Research Institute. Welcome to the 5th William & Mary panel discussion on the war in Ukraine. These conversations have been organized by the Global Research Institute, by the Reeves Center for International Studies, and by the Russian and Post-Soviet Studies program. We've learned a lot in the last month about the conflict. William & Mary alums who are journalists on the ground in Ukraine have been part of these conversations. Ukrainian academics who visited as Fulbright scholars who are now in Kiev and Lviv have visited with us in these conversations. And we've had a larger number of area studies specialists from the William & Mary faculty who've participated and taught us so much. In the first Global Research Institute event that we held, I think it was about 1 month ago. It was right after the first week of the war. We learned about alliance politics from Professor Amy Oakes, disinformation campaigns from AIDA's Lincoln Zaleski, and Russian domestic politics from our very own Vice Provost for International Affairs, Steve Hansen. I think it's really important to look at wars like this from multiple different perspectives, people from different disciplines, and scholars who have expertise on different issue areas and different components of the conflict. This breadth is made possible by GRI's commitment to multidisciplinary research. At GRI, many of you may know, we are committed to doing applied research on real world problems, and we do this in a collaborative way. All our projects include students, faculty, and practitioner partners. Many of our signature projects at GRI, such as AIDA and TRIP, emerged from student ideas. We think good ideas can come from anyone, not just gray-haired folks with PhDs. Our panel tonight reflects this belief. Jeff Kaplow is a professor in the government department and the director of NukeLab. He will talk about strategic stability, escalation, and the prospects for the use of WMD in the war in Ukraine. Del Manson, William & Mary class of 22, is a research fellow in the Project on International Peace and Security, or PIPS. And tonight he'll share his thoughts on autonomous weapons and the future of conflict. This work builds on a white paper that Del is writing now as part of the PIPS program. Kelebogile Zvobgo is a professor in the government department and the director of the International Justice Lab. She will present in collaboration with one of her co-authors and a fellow in the IJL lab, Nathaniel, also class of 2022. They will address the issue of international legal responses to Russian abuses in Ukraine. It's hard to imagine picking a more timely set of questions to talk about. In terms of nuts and bolts, each group is going to talk for 10 minutes each. I've given Nathan and Kelly a little bit more time, since there are two of them, to talk about the human rights issues and the legal issues that have been raised recently. Then there'll be panel Q&A, and then we'll open it up. The majority of the time will be dedicated to questions and answers, a conversation with the audience. When that time comes, I'll just ask you to write your name in the chat, and I'll call on you in the order that I see you in the chat, and we'll have a conversation. Okay? Great. Well, Jeff, can you kick us off?
Yes, I can. Let me just share some slides. Is that visible? Okay, great. I study nuclear weapons, so it's always kind of a bad sign when I'm asked to be on a panel. It's not a good sign for the world, but I'm pleased to be part of the group today. It's not just good business for me. I came across this article a couple of weeks ago from The Guardian talking about a surge in interest in bunkers. So companies that make fallout shelters and other kinds of bunkers are doing really well. And a lot of this seems to be related to kind of nuclear fear. So it's a quote from someone who runs a website dedicated to disaster preparedness. He said that Traffic on the website had increased a lot in the last few weeks. The top on-site search terms have been nuclear, iodine, EMP, radiation sickness. So people are worried about the risk of nuclear escalation, and that's what I want to focus on today. But in addition to this issue of nuclear escalation, there are many other kind of nuclear adjacent issues that are associated with Russia's invasion. And I'm going to kind of lay them out here. Happy to talk about any of these that folks want to talk about in the Q&A, but I will kind of focus my attention on what could happen that could take us from where we are today to the use of nuclear weapons. But we might also consider, what if Ukraine had kept the nuclear weapons it had at the end of the Cold War with the fall of the Soviet Union? What about this Russian disinformation campaign about Ukrainian nuclear weapons program? The danger of nuclear reactors in a war zone. Nuclear reactors generally not designed to be in a war zone, and so there are a lot of risks associated with that. And then implications of what does this invasion mean for the future of nuclear proliferation kind of generally, and the future of arms control, where the US kind of has to cooperate with Russia. What does that look like given the situation in Ukraine? So other nuclear issues are out there, but I want to focus on this question of nuclear escalation. So I endeavor in every presentation to have one slide that's like positive message. So this is that slide. The risk of nuclear escalation is low. So take a second, soak in the positive vibes. Everyone got it? Okay. But the risk is much higher than it was 6 weeks ago before this war started, right? So the absolute risk of nuclear escalation is still quite low, but the relative risk has jumped significantly now that we're in a conflict where parties to both sides have nuclear weapons. Where does this risk come from? Well, we can look at different aspects of this conflict as kind of sources of risk of escalation generally, and nuclear escalation specifically. So there's the issue of heightened alert. Whenever, just by virtue of being kind of in a conflict where people are worried about the risk of military action, the risk of nuclear use goes up, principally the risk of misinterpretation, mistakes, accidental use. So when I say heightened alert here, I don't really mean alert in the sense that military forces use it. I don't mean DEFCON levels or readiness levels. I mean the idea that there are troops moving in proximity to military action that's ongoing. There's the risk of there's aircraft, there are missiles, there's a risk of accidents happening that way. There's a heightened level of readiness just generally within the military forces on both sides, and that increases the risk of escalation. There's Russia's lack of progress in the war. And here, just by virtue of the fact that this conflict has gone on for so long, the risk of nuclear escalation increases. Had this been a quick march to Kiev and the end of Ukraine, as Russia clearly hoped and wanted it to be, then we wouldn't be talking about nuclear escalation right now. But the fact that we are kind of shifting into this war of attrition kind of a situation means that there are a number of other pathways to nuclear escalation that are on the table, including one that comes up as Russia gets kind of close to losing a conflict. And we can talk about that in a bit. There's the potential that Russian doctrine might call for the use of low-yield nuclear weapons in a particular context to send a signal to the combatants that they are serious and that the cost of continuing the conflict will be high for the adversary. And this is sometimes known in the West as escalate to de-escalate doctrine. I'll talk more about that in a moment. There's the potential for Russian use of chemical and biological weapons. We've heard kind of US policymakers kind of preparing the world for this possibility. And I think this is one of the things that could change the calculus for NATO in terms of increased military involvement and thus increased risk of escalation. There's NATO support for Ukraine. Everything from sanctions to the support in terms of military capabilities that's going to the Ukrainian military. All of that creates a situation where Russia might feel the need to retaliate. And that, of course, is very escalatory. And calls we're hearing to increase US and NATO involvement in response to Russian atrocities in Ukraine also kind of put additional pressure on this issue. And then finally, there's questions about Vladimir Putin's political situation, his state of mind. I think there's quite a lot of uninformed speculation out there about kind of Putin's state of mind, what he's thinking. People have talked about, oh, he's in this COVID bubble. I've been in a COVID bubble and I haven't invaded anyone, so I don't know that we can really explain Putin's behavior in that way. But there's at least the idea out there that maybe he's not making rational decisions. I'm a little skeptical of this. I'm also a little skeptical that Putin is kind of losing his grip on power, but there have been analysts who've talked about this. And if Putin's grip on power starts to slip away, then that adds an element of risk when it comes to nuclear use if Putin feels like the way to hang on to power is to take this conflict nuclear. So those are kind of the factors that come into the calculation of nuclear risk in this situation. There are a few possible scenarios that take us from the situation we're in today, kind of a conventional conflict, into possible nuclear use in the future. So one of those is an accident or mistaken intentions. A missile goes too far and lands in Poland. A Russian aircraft overflies a NATO state and is shot down, and that can lead to additional risk. I'm not tremendously worried about that scenario because neither side sees those kinds of events as existential risk to them. So if a missile landed in Poland, the US would not respond by launching nuclear weapons at Russia. So this level of risk is a little bit different. I think that's not a high risk right now. There is the risk of tactical nuclear use to signal resolve, which I think is a fairly significant risk. And then there's the risk of strategic nuclear use to ensure state survival. So if Putin feels like he is losing his grip on power, as I just mentioned, for Putin, he is the state, right? So if Putin is not going to survive, then he may feel like it makes sense for him to resort to nuclear weapons to keep his grip on power. I want to take you through kind of one scenario for how this all might play out in the case of tactical nuclear use. So just so everyone knows what I'm talking about here, tactical or non-strategic nuclear weapons are smaller weapons comparable to, say, the nuclear weapon that the US dropped on Hiroshima in World War II. That was a 15 kiloton weapon. Russia has a number of 10 kiloton weapons in its arsenal. So really big weapon in a normal sense, but small for a nuclear weapon. That the real definition of tactical is entirely in the eye of the beholder, but we can just think of them as kind of smaller nuclear weapons in this case. Analysts worry that Russia could decide to use a tactical nuclear weapon in Russia, but it's important to note that there's no military utility associated with these weapons. There's no kind of mission that we need a nuclear weapon or that Russia needs a nuclear weapon to accomplish. Its entire purpose is to kill a lot of people or to signal the willingness to kill many people. Okay, so there's been a big debate in kind of my little world about Russian doctrine that's known in the West as escalate to de-escalate. This is the idea that Russia might resort to nuclear weapons or maybe some kind of severe conventional escalation in order to signal its resolve and also the high cost that the adversary would have to pay to continue the fight. So we're at the kind of a beginning of a conflict. Russia decides it's going to drop nuclear weapons, small ones, just to show that if NATO wants to continue that fight, they're going to bear a very high cost to continuing it. Now, I think there's a debate over this doctrine. I happen to be a escalate to de-escalate skeptic. I don't think this is really part of Russian nuclear doctrine, but it kind of doesn't matter if it's this little debate, at least, whether it's part of doctrine or not. If this is something that Putin thinks is viable and is a good path forward, then it's something that we need to worry about. So what would this look like? Well, imagine for a minute a Ukrainian offensive that threatens to push Russia out of the Donbass in the east of the country. And this would be like a pretty significant loss for Russia in the conflict. And Russia responds by using a tactical nuclear weapon against Ukrainian forces. Well, what would NATO do? So take a moment. What do you think NATO would do to respond to this kind of a strategy, to the use of a tactical nuclear weapon? So if you were thinking in your head, they'll nuke them back, well, there's actually going to be, I think, if this happens, substantial pressure to do just this. And there's some prominent voices, op-eds have already been written, making the case that if Russia just resorts to some kind of tactical nuclear use, the appropriate US NATO response would be that kind of in-kind nuclear use or even larger, right? We need to go bigger. We need to show that we're not intimidated by Russia doing this. So Russia would have used that nuclear weapon to show what cost it was willing to, what cost NATO would have to bear if it continued. And so then we need to show what cost Russia bears for making that kind of a threat. And you get this kind of a tit for tat approach. My strong suspicion, however, is that NATO actually would respond with a serious conventional escalation, would resist the urge to respond in kind with nuclear weapons, but would respond with really ramping up the conventional war in Ukraine. So then we can step back and ask, what if Russia takes this strategy, what did it actually achieve? So if I'm right and NATO responds with a serious conventional escalation, then Russia has invited this big NATO involvement in the war that they've been trying to avoid. And if I'm wrong and the US resorts to an in-kind use of nuclear weapons, then Russia's gotten its own forces nuked. And so in either case, this doesn't seem like a strong approach for Russia, a strong strategy for Russia. But let me make one minor adjustment to the scenario. What if instead of a Ukrainian offensive that threatens to push Russia out of the Donbas, it's actually a NATO offensive? What if NATO has ramped up its military forces to the point where it's involved in the conflict and it's making strong gains against Russia, and then Russia responds by using a tactical nuclear weapon against NATO forces? Well, now we have a much more dangerous situation. The risk of nuclear escalation from here is pretty substantial, and it's also a non-insignificant possibility that Russia would resort to this kind of a approach, and that NATO would listen. NATO would say, all right, let's stop here, because this runs a very serious risk of a strategic nuclear exchange. And so I think this kind of a scenario where NATO is more deeply involved runs a much higher risk of escalation. And that's, I think, the point I want to make here, that I want to end on. An expansion of NATO involvement dramatically increases the risk of each of these scenarios, from accidental use to tactical use to strategic nuclear use. And so in some sense, like, the call is coming from inside the house, or maybe the nuclear escalation we were looking for was in our hearts the whole time, right? So it's NATO that is really in control of a lot of this kind of potential for escalation. I'm not saying that NATO is responsible for any of this, right? So this conflict is 100% Russia's fault, right? There's no blame to be shared here, but I think NATO does have more control over the outcome than is sometimes they're sometimes given credit for. It sometimes comes up in public discourse about this. So in my view, a no-fly zone or a similar policy like that involves US troops shooting at Russian troops or NATO troops shooting at Russian troops is a really bad idea. Deterrence is currently working on both sides. The US is successfully deterring Russian attacks on military staging areas in Poland, and we are being deterred. The NATO is being deterred by Russian nuclear weapons from escalating further. And that's okay, I think. I think there's sometimes this discussion of, well, we can't let Russia deter us, right? But what we should let Russia deter us when it comes to the use of potential nuclear weapons. If we knew there was an action we were going to take that was going to lead to a nuclear exchange, we should not take that action. And so in some sense, deterrence is helping kind of keep us in the right zone here. That said, there is a good faith argument that basically says we need to do more to address kind of the huge human toll, the human cost of this conflict. There are costs escalating in both directions. There's costs to escalating too much, the cost I just talked about of nuclear exchange. There's cost to escalating too little. It means we're not giving the full amount of support to Ukraine that we could be giving. And I don't know exactly where that line is, but I know I don't want to stumble over it. So I actually think we're kind of striking a reasonable balance here. I'll just end by saying, at the moment, the risk of nuclear escalation remains low. The risk of so if you're looking, where do you focus your concern? I'm worried enough about nuclear escalation that I keep in the back of my head, but I do this for a living. I think the focus of our concern really should be on the human cost of the war right now, the thousands of people who've been killed, the thousands more who are kind of suffering through what's going on in the course of this war. We should be most concerned, I think, with the tragedy that's actually happening, rather than the tragedy that stands some small chance of happening in the future. And so on that kind of difficult note, I'll leave it there and look forward to talking more in the Q&A.
Great. Thanks very much, Jeff. Appreciate that. Our next speaker, as I said earlier, is Del Manson. Del, I'm going to ask you to call an audible either at the beginning or at the end of your presentation, and take 15 seconds to tell the audience about the 2 PIPS symposiums that are coming up and where you all will be and how people can engage with that.
Sure. And let me go ahead and share my screen. Okay, hello everyone. My name is Del Manson. It's an honor to speak with you all today about my current research project on small loading munitions and the impact that these weapons will have on the crisis in Ukraine. So small loading munitions are autonomous drones with a warhead that use electro-optical targeting, which is basically the same type of camera that you find in your phone. It uses AI guidance, and it can fly between 15 to 45 minutes. And it's about the size, it can range in size from the size of a baseball bat to about 1.5 meters. Small loading munitions can hover in the air, and it can just wait before it strikes its target. All these capabilities come in just a very small package that can do significant damage. As you can see in these pictures, this man is shooting a small munition and it's hitting this truck with the artillery on it. So just a couple of weeks ago, it was made public that a drone called the Switchblade had been given to Ukraine as part of a larger $800 million aid package. And the main question, I think, is why? What makes these small drones so special for Ukrainian forces? Well, this question for weak states in general is the current focus of my project. And I'm investigating how small munitions can empower these states. And I argue that it provides the individual soldier with new aerial power projection capabilities. In my project, I focus on the negative implications of this type of power that it will have in the hands of state and non-state actors. Right now, however, I want to focus on the positive impact of sending these weapons to Ukraine. So the warhead on a Switchblade 300 is powerful enough to take out artillery pieces or highly armored vehicles or lightly armored vehicles. The Switchblade 600 can strike Russian tanks and other heavily armored vehicles. What makes them so useful is that when a Ukrainian soldier launches a drone, they do not need to see their target. They just need to be within 6 to 25 miles. Here's a map of 25 miles outside of Kyiv. If you compare that to 25 miles outside of Washington, D.C., you could be as far away as the border of Fairfax County and still launch a Switchblade 600 into the heart of D.C. That is an incredible amount of power to give to one individual soldier. And the Ukrainian soldier, all they have to do is input the characteristics of what they want to hit, such as a Russian missile launcher. They can sneak outside and fire. The drone will do most of the work for them. The conflict in Ukraine is now entering a new phase. Russia has pulled back from Kyiv and are now attempting to weaken Ukrainian forces in the east through constant bombardment. This places Russian targets, such as the ground missile launches that they're using, further away. Older anti-craft weapons, such as mortars or javelins, have been effective in shooting down Russian aircraft and tanks up close. However, these weapons often require the Ukrainian soldiers to see the target in which they're hitting. Right now, they cannot get close to those weapons because they are being faced with all these air bombardments, like in the city of Mariupol. However, Ukrainians can respond by switching to fighting in small squads of 1 to 3 people that can quickly move without being detected. They can then use a small ammunition to target Russian artillery from a safe distance. This type of sparse movement is difficult to detect, and the Switchblade drone presents a small radar target that is both hard to detect and difficult or expensive to counter. The importance of the Switchblade drone in Ukraine is really about empowering the individual soldier to project aerial power and inflict damage on distant forces. Access to small munitions can change the game of ground warfare. As we look to future conflicts, these types of systems are going to appear more and more, particularly among insurgent type forces. Here you can see these are some small munitions that are being developed by an Israeli company. So when you give these type of weapons to big actors, or if you give them to small actors, heavily armed armies like Russia cannot just assume that their weapons and vehicles are protected from aerial attacks. As much as they can threaten Ukraine with bombardments, Ukrainians with smaller munitions such as these can also take out their weapon systems. So if you're interested in learning more about my research and on other topics in international security, I would like to invite you to the PIP Symposium next Thursday, April 14th from 5:15 to 6:45. This year's research fellows, including myself and my intern, Elijah, we will be presenting all of our projects in full. The Project of International Peace and Security is an undergraduate think tank based at William & Mary's Global Research Institute. In each fall, 6 research fellows are chosen to identify an emerging threat to national security, and they develop original policy recommendations in a white paper to address those challenges. At the symposium, I and my intern will be talking about the negative consequences of the proliferation of small munitions to malign international state and non-state actors. If you'd like to know more information about PIPS, I can also put their website in the chat. But thank you all for your attention.
Del, I should have known that you would have been organized enough going in to have a plan to tell them about PIPS. So thank you for looking forward to that. I'm really looking forward to the on-campus symposium of PIPS next week on the 14th. I don't know if I can make it up to DC, but I'm super psyched about the one on campus. So thanks, Del. Our next 2 speakers are Kelebogile Zvobgo and Nathan Liu. Who's going to start? Kelly or Nathan? Somebody's muted.
Dr. Zvobgo will begin.
Okay, great.
All right, I'm just gonna put on my timer so that I do not abuse everyone's kindness. All right, thanks everyone for coming to this evening's event, just the latest installment of conversations here at William and Mary to address the war in Ukraine and abuses by Russia. Today, one of my fellows and I will be talking, we'll be giving the legal perspective on the war between Ukraine and Russia, beginning first with the context for international law, then moving on to 3 international courts that have jurisdiction and differing jurisdiction over abuses in Ukraine by Russia, and we'll conclude with the discussion of other forums or opportunities for justice. So first, I would actually like a little audience participation. So either, just speak, unmute and speak, or enter into the chat your answer to this question. What is the most fundamental norm of international relations? And we'll get to test some of your professors also to see if we're all on the same page. Okay, so we have state sovereignty, cooperation, sovereignty again, respect for state borders and sovereignty, nuclear non-use. Okay, good representation. Professor Kaplow, communication and diplomacy, borders, trust, territorial integrity, rule of law, respect all around. All right, these are all excellent answers. And now commerce. Oh, interesting. How capitalist. Treaties. Okay. All right. So thank you for your contributions. And so many of you hit the nail on the head. The most fundamental norm of international relations is territorial integrity of the state and sovereignty over national affairs. But there are exceptions to the norm. And if you're taking either my freshman human rights class or my senior transitional justice class, as I was situating the importance of these 2 areas of political science, human rights, and transitional justice, that, while we think a lot about state security, territorial integrity, national sovereignty, we do make exceptions for this most fundamental norm. And that is in instances where serious abuses are alleged, in particular, war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, and the crime of aggression. So the crimes of most serious concern to the international community. So we are giving the legal perspective. We've heard and will continue to hear in the conversation once that opens up about military, economic, and diplomatic responses to the war. Now, I want to define very quickly some terms since we'll be using them, and they've been used and misused in popular parlance. And so we have war crimes, the crime of aggression, genocide, and also actually crimes against humanity. And what's interesting, at least for international law people, and I hope for you also, is that if we think of one person being killed, right? That killing could fall under any number of these definitions. So in the case of war crimes, it could be a civilian who is willfully targeted, right? And so is murdered without any military interest, et cetera. And so that could be a war crime. If that individual is part of a large group of individuals that are being systematically targeted in a widespread manner, that would be tantamount to a crime against humanity. If that individual among a collective of individuals is being targeted for their racial, ethnic, national, or religious identity, that could be tantamount to genocide. And if these people are being killed in furtherance of a violation of that most fundamental norm of IR, that is tantamount to aggression. And so all of these are abuses of humanitarian law, or the laws of war, but then also the laws of peace, and that is human rights. And Nathan will talk more about that. But for all of these, prosecuting individuals is very difficult because you must get them into physical custody. That is the first challenge. And the second challenge is the evidentiary standard to get convictions successfully. These, again, like I said, are the most serious crimes of concern to the international community. And so they need exceedingly high levels of proof, a lot of rigor. And so that makes them hard to prove. They take very long periods of time, and all the world is watching. So they are highly consequential and can result in very serious sentences, including life sentences. No capital punishment that is contra international law and human rights, but can definitely result in harsh penalties.
So the three international courts we'll talk about are investigating alleged atrocities committed by Russia. And you can see on the screen, those are the International Court of Justice, the International Criminal Court, and the European Court of Human Rights. So first, the ICJ is one of the 6 main organs of the United Nations, and it adjudicates disputes between states and over UN treaty law. UN submitted a complaint on February 26th, asking the court to order Russia to suspend military actions. And it based its claim on the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of Genocide. It's a little bit of a creative and complicated legal argument. But basically, the court granted provisional measures on March 16th, confirming that they had a plausible basis for having jurisdiction and that there is an urgent risk of irreparable harm. So again, these are only interim measures, meaning that the judges will rule on the core of the substance of the case at a later date, but that there is that immediate risk. Obviously, Russia has not complied with the orders to cease military operations. Part of that's because the ICJ relies on the UN Security Council to enforce its judgments. And Russia, of course, is a permanent member of the council and can veto enforcement. Nevertheless, even an unenforced ICJ judgment symbolically affirms important norms, such as that countries can't just start wars for any reason. And the case also highlights the dichotomy between Russia and Ukraine, where Russia is not engaging productively with international law and institutions, while Ukraine is doing everything it can to follow the rule of law. Furthermore, it is important that the court worked so quickly and decisively to deliver the provisional measures. The judges were nearly unanimous, actually, in granting the provisions, which is not a small matter. The International Criminal Court is a treaty body created by the Rome Statute in 1998. And the treaty establishes the court's jurisdiction over atrocities and holding individuals criminally accountable. So unlike the International Court of Justice, the ICC can hold accountable army soldiers or senior leaders. Ukraine is not a member of the ICC, but has already accepted the jurisdiction of the court for any suspected abuses from 2014 onwards. This is because of an ongoing case. The current chief prosecutor has decided to incorporate investigations of the ongoing war into that existing case. This should speed up the investigations. For example, the preliminary examination already concluded in December 2020 that there was a reasonable basis to believe that war crimes and crimes against humanity had been committed. Another factor that will help the investigations move quickly is the referral of the ongoing war to the ICC by 41 states, a large coalition. If the court does summon Russian nationals to appear before the court, it will be difficult to enforce compliance, as Professor Zvobgo said. However, even if Russian officers and soldiers will never stand trial before the court, indictments could make them targets of travel bans and other sanctions. Traveling abroad, if that happens, then traveling abroad would make them vulnerable to arrest by ICC member states, which are obligated to arrest court fugitives. And finally, the European Court of Human Rights has a mandate to examine violations of the 1950 European Convention on Human Rights by members of the Council of Europe, which is an organization that does include both Ukraine and Russia, up to March 16th. The court granted 3 interim measures on March 1st, 4th, and 10th. The first 2 ordered Russia to cease military attacks against civilians and provide unimpeded access to humanitarian aid. The third measure concerned the silencing of independent media in Russia. While Russia has not complied, of course, interim measures can have a deterrent effect and theoretically prevent the worst human rights violations from happening. Since those interim measures have been granted, on March 16th, the Council of Ministers expelled Russia from the Council of Europe. Russia had already been suspended in February, and on March 15th, Russia had declared its intentions to withdraw. The Council's decision to expel Russia was likely influenced by the reputational benefits of moving proactively rather than reactively. Unfortunately, this means that any violations of the convention by Russia after March 16th cannot be challenged at the court. This is a setback for international accountability, especially as it leaves ordinary Russians in Russia, as well as people in Ukraine and elsewhere in Europe, with one less avenue for redress for Russian abuses. And I'll turn it back to Professor Zvobgo for a bit of a conclusion.
Fantastic. Thank you, Nathan. And so we now turn to a discussion of other opportunities for international justice. And so universal jurisdiction basically empowers countries to conduct investigations domestically for serious crimes of concern to the international community. We saw this, for example, with former Chilean leader Augusto Pinochet, who was in the United Kingdom in London and was transferred to Spanish courts, to Spain to stand trial in Spanish courts for abuses in his native Chile. And there's also the possibility of an ad hoc tribunal, possibly for just the crime of aggression, which again is transgressing the territorial integrity of Ukraine in this case, and attempting to seat a pro-Russia government. And so advocates of this ad hoc tribunal just for this crime, which cannot be addressed at any of the courts we have discussed up until this point, include Ben Ferencz, the last surviving prosecutor from the Nuremberg trials, as well as former UK Prime Minister Gordon Brown and others. And so these are other complementary opportunities for international justice. Thank you. Follow us on Twitter and visit our website for more about research our team members are doing, and to keep up on all things related to justice in Ukraine.
Fantastic. Thank you, Nathan and Kelly. Appreciate that. I'm going to ask a few questions from the chair, and then the panelists can ignore them or not. And then the panelists, if you would like to ask each other a few questions to get them on the table, we'll have this short conversation, and then I'm just going to turn to the audience. So if you would like to ask a question, please just list your name in the chat, and I'm just going to call on you in the order in which I see your name in about 10 minutes once we get done with this round of questions. So I'll just go in order. I'm going to start with Jeff. Jeff, I have two questions. First, you made the comment, you reassured us that the risk of nuclear escalation was low. You said it wasn't as low as it was 6 weeks ago, but don't worry, it's low. And so I'd like you to do a bit more comparison, especially for those of us who have gray hair. Do you think the risk of escalation today is higher or lower than it was, say, in the early 1960s, before the Cuban Missile Crisis, before the hotline? And second, do you think it's higher or lower than it was in the 1980s, in the early 1980s, say, the height of the Second Cold War? So first question, Jeff, is probability of escalation. Second, you took us through one scenario where we might see escalation to nukes, and it had to do with NATO forces getting involved directly in combat. So I just would like to ask the prior question. What are the specific events that you think would dramatically increase the probability of NATO forces moving off its current policy of no-fly zones and no direct combat? What are the kinds of things that could draw NATO into direct military conflict with Russian forces? As you know, Kelly and Nathan were talking, I couldn't help but think about what we've learned in the last few days about Bucha and other cases. You know, what else would we have to see in order for the demand for NATO to do something? So those are my questions for Jeff. For Del, I wonder if you could connect your your broader research project, as I understand it, suggests that the spread of this relatively cheap autonomous weapons technology will disproportionately benefit malign forces. So I took that to mean small groups, terrorists, folks who want to do us no good. And yet here, in this case of Ukraine, your examples were of the Ukrainians, a conventional military defending their own sovereignty against a Russian invasion. Today, as I understand it, Ukraine is being flooded with autonomous weapons from many, many different countries. Some quite small, like the Switchblade that you talked about, but some larger, like the drones that Turkey sent. What are the negative externalities? Like, can you connect up the Ukraine case with your broader research agenda, right? Or do you worry about these getting into the wrong hands? Like, there was a lot of discussion after the United States armed the Mujahideen in Afghanistan that led to the Taliban and Al-Qaeda having access to these, Stinger missiles, for example. Is there a similar dynamic going on with Russia and Ukraine? Nathan and Kelly, 2 questions. First, I'm sorry to jump ahead to something that's not in your presentation, but today, while you were working hard teaching students and taking classes, Russia was expelled from the United Nations Human Rights Council. And so I guess my question is, does this matter? If it does, why does it matter? If it doesn't, why not? And were you surprised by the vote? Like, did you know they were going to get expelled? Because you know about the politics of human rights. Were there real big surprises? Some countries did not vote to expel, or some countries did. So that's the first question. My second question is, where else have you all been disseminating information about international law in the context of the Ukraine case? Where are you publishing? And specifically, I'm interested to hear from Nathan, what have you learned about the publishing process that you didn't know before this started? So, Jeff, you're first.
Okay, thanks, Mike. Yeah, so on the probability of nuclear escalation, I don't think I said not to worry. You should worry, but the overall level is low, even though it's a lot higher now than it was. So just to give kind of comparisons, I don't think the risk is as high as it was in kind of the early 80s. We had a couple of very close calls in the early 80s where some misinterpreted actions on both sides nearly led to nuclear war. So the early 80s was a rough time for the risk of inadvertent escalation. The difference here is that so much of this revolves around kind of the military conflict, right? And the risk of the military conflict leading to additional conventional escalation, which then leads to potential nuclear escalation. So while the risk is probably lower than it was in the early 80s, in the current state of things, I think there's the potential here for potential conventional escalation that leads to greater nuclear escalation. I think another time when I was really worried was rhetoric with North Korea in 2018. This is the time when President Trump was tweeting about fire and fury and having a larger nuclear button than North Korea. And there was a real concern that there was going to be some misinterpretation of some exercise or missile test that was going to lead to things spiraling out of control. So we have had time periods where nuclear use was kind of on the table in a way that is scary and not great. And I think we're kind of back in that world now. But it's certainly not as bad as it could be. And I think, as I said, like NATO involvement directly in the conflict would dramatically increase those kinds of risks. So what would lead to that involvement? I think the issue I highlighted, that these increasing calls for additional NATO intervention. I think the Biden administration has drawn a pretty strong line here that we're not going to see an attempt at a no-fly zone or anything like that. Barring some dramatic change in events on the ground. One of those changes could be the use of chemical and biological weapons. I think that would cause a rethink of NATO policy. And I think the threat of that is likely to prevent Russia from going that route. At least I hope it will. The other thing is attacks beyond Ukraine. So if we saw the conflict spread to Poland in some way and threaten actual NATO forces that are arrayed in NATO states, I think the firm line about protecting NATO as a group any attack on any NATO member is going to lead to a dramatic change in NATO policy toward Ukraine. So I think those are the kind of key factors. The atrocities that we're seeing coming out of Russia, the kind of horror on the ground, I don't think that that's likely to lead to additional NATO intervention, although we'll certainly increase calls in some quarters for that. The other thing that NATO has to worry about is that it's a bunch of individual countries with individual foreign policies. And so it is possible for some NATO members to make different kinds of decisions about where to draw this line and how much risk they can run in providing support to Ukraine. And so we could see a situation where, some country gets out ahead of NATO as a whole, and we see the rest of NATO trying to pull that back. But I think, with the current situation today, that risk is low. If conventional escalation results in NATO troops getting involved, shooting at Russians, I think the risk of some kind of escalation goes way up.
James Card in the comments, Jeff, is going to ask a follow-up. So please return to that. Read his comment. He's providing yet another slippery slope argument into escalation. Del, do you want to respond to my questions connecting your broader research to the Ukraine case?
Yes, sure. So my research is actually trying to challenge the conventional notion of how we think weapons such as the Switchblade, these smaller munitions, can benefit states. So in the case of Ukraine, it can benefit the army in which they can fight against larger enemies, such as the Russian army, which is what they're doing right now. My project is seeking to flip that kind of notion and say when these proliferate to different actors, this can also be used by state actors for bad. These can be used by state actors badly. They can also be used by non-state actors. And I want to focus in on first non-state actors and then move on to state actors. So for non-state actors, when you think of the terrorists or the other groups, the threat that they have, they can use these weapons to challenge the government, much like we've seen with other times when the United States or other countries have given, armed these kind of insurgent groups, and they've turned around and used it on the government that they actually wanted to support. We saw this throughout the Cold War. We saw this play in with the war on terror and throughout the last couple of decades. And now there is a risk that if we are giving these weapons to these types of insurgent groups, they can very well be used against the same governments. However, I would also want to point out that these weapons they're different in the sense that they're a lot cheaper, and you may not need to go through, the big states like Russia or China or the United States to get these weapons. They're cheap enough that your mid-level states such as Turkey or Iran, they can also buy these weapons and sell them to any non-state group that they want. Moving to the state factor, I think there's also a great risk for states to use these for bad reasons. Again, these are weapons that are autonomous. You shoot these up, they're going to find their target and they can attack them. And there have already been cases where autocratic leaders, such as in Libya, have used these type of weapons to attack civilians, to attack opposition forces in their own country. Even in Russia, they've actually used their own version of a small munition against the Ukrainians. So the proliferation risk is very real. And in my project, I go into, instead of focusing on how states can use this for their benefit, how can state and non-state actors use this to attack domestic opponents, to attack international opponents, and to increase their power? Now, I'll end on just one specific example in thinking about what's going on in Latin American countries, specifically in Mexico. A lot of Mexican drug cartel groups are using drones, and they strap a small bomb on them to attack Mexican state authorities. Now, these are very rudimentary types of drone weapons, but if you were to give the Switchblade 300 to these types of cartel groups, they can start inflicting a lot of damage on the state. And that is the real threat that I want to address in my project.
Thanks, Del. It makes me want to go to the symposium even more next week. Okay, so Kelly and Nathan, I hate to do this, but we're going to pile on a follow-on question that came out of the chat. So Kelly, in addition to explaining, the removal of Russia from the Human Rights Council in the UN, could you also, the nice thing is Kelly's not only an expert on international law, but also international organizations. Can you also address the question about whether it is possible to expel Russia from the UN Security Council, which came up in the chat? Thanks.
Thanks so much for the question. I also noted another one in the chat, so I'm going to try and proceed systematically. So first, Russia was not kicked out of the United Nations writ large, okay? Russia remains a member of the United Nations, one of the 195 countries, and Russia remains a permanent member of the UN Security Council. There have been talks to have Security Council reform, such that you could not have such clear conflicts of interest impede international intervention, right? The United Nations was established to advance peace and security in the world, development, and human rights. And so to the extent that Russia is against these and more, it is highly problematic for it to have such an influential role at the United Nations. Now, the body that Russia was kicked out of is the UN Human Rights Council, which is one of the major organs of the United Nations, right up there with the Economic, Social Council, the UN Secretariat, the General Assembly, the UN Security Council. And so, through a deliberative process, through a vote, Russia was eliminated from the UN Human Rights Council. This body is charged with monitoring the compliance of UN member states with human rights generally. It is distinct from and indeed broader than the treaty bodies. For example, the Human Rights Committee, which oversees compliance with the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. So lots of alphabet soup, but this is my wheelhouse. So thank you for the questions. Happy to field more. Now, in terms of people or countries rather that voted against, and actually I'll give you the full breakdown for the votes. And so you have 93 countries in favor, 58 countries abstaining, and 24 countries opposing. And for those that opposed the move is my own home country of Zimbabwe. Always great to be in a club that is defying human rights. Countries that are close to Russia, such as Syria, of course, Russia itself, some post-Soviet successor states like Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, Iran, and known human rights violators, including Eritrea as one example, and North Korea. Okay. There are some interesting abstentions. So since this was asked, so we have, for example, Egypt and El Salvador abstaining, a lot of global South countries, both Niger and Nigeria, Oman, Pakistan, others, and Saudi Arabia, a key power in the Middle East and the world more generally, abstaining from this vote. And, unsurprisingly, China, which is taking notes for how the world responds to Russia and Ukraine because it has its own ambitions of territorial aggrandizement, voted against. And so that's where we are. It has been removed from this particular body within the UN, not from the UN itself, not from the Security Council. I know there was a question in the chat about potential moves to remove Russia from the Security Council. That is exceedingly unlikely. I don't know the full procedures for Security Council removal because it's never happened, and I don't think it's ever likely to happen. And even if we tried, Russia's got a friend in China, right, which just voted against its removal from the UN Human Rights Council, and which is small fry compared to the Security Council, so unlikely there. And also, the U.S. is taking notice. So kind of, displaced from this conversation is the United States, which is calling for war crimes prosecutions of Putin, including at the International Criminal Court. And the US has said before that the court does not have jurisdiction over non-member nationals because the US has been implicated in serious abuses in Afghanistan and others. And here we are having, elected officials in Congress, diplomats saying that, well, the ICC maybe should look into Russia. So we are in an awkward position, and certainly putting something to a vote like let's get rid of Russia from the Security Council, that what's good for the goose must be good for the gander, and so that could very well be us. So exceedingly low probability, but certainly high impact outcome. I think you will all remember what I can only describe as trolling by the Ukrainian delegate who said, when did we accept that Russia would be the successor of the Soviet Union at the United Nations, right? There was no formal succession of Russia as the continuation of the Soviet Union in terms of its multilateral ties and international agreements. And so that was pretty funny. But in theory, one day, when pigs fly, we could get rid of Russia under this mechanism. But I'll pass on now to Nathan to talk about the many outlets that have featured IJL researchers and IJL research and reflections on the publishing process.
Yes, so some of those avenues have included Foreign Policy magazine, as well as the Washington Post, and we've disseminated those through Twitter and other social media. And I think those of us in the lab, there are 7 of us current undergraduate fellows, have been working with Professor Zvobgo throughout our time here to look at how we can turn academic scholarship into public scholarship, and take the rigorous peer-reviewed things that we do and disseminate them into the public. And of course, this presentation is part of that effort. And I would say something that I learned about the publishing process is the role of the editors. So at both magazines, the editors, it's a conversation between the authors and the editors as to the priorities of the article and kind of what has to be cut, because public scholarship does have to be so short. There can be, of course, nuance, but I guess only so much before the editors say you're getting on too long. So, there's, of course, these 3 courts that we talked about. We'd be happy to talk in the future also about diplomatic sanctions, such as the expulsion from the Human Rights Council, or even non-judicial mechanisms that Ukraine could potentially pursue in pursuit of some form of justice in the future, but can only talk about so much in one article.
Great. When's the next IJL public-facing article coming out, Nathan?
There is one in the works at the Washington Post, written by my classmate Zoha Sadeki. And I don't know if Professor, when that will come out.
Yeah, so next week, early next week, I believe. So this will be our 4th piece of public scholarship. So like Nathan said, we published in Foreign Policy. And so that was co-authored with Nathan, Daniel Postumus, and Zoha Siddiqui. And then the next was in the Washington Post in Outlook with Nathan and myself. And then the Washington Post Monkey Cage with Daniel, and then now with Zoha. And so we kind of had a team publication at Foreign Policy, and then these follow-on 3 with dyads, and I think we'll probably do the next one as a team of 4 again. So do be on the lookout, internationaljusticelab.org, to be apprised of the different publications that we are preparing. And then also, for those of you who watch CNN at noon, I will be on with Frederica Whitfield in Newsroom this Saturday.
Fantastic. That's what I'll be doing on Saturday. All right, we're going to open this up to Q&A from the audience. I have a list currently of 7 people that I don't think had their questions addressed in the chat. Let's take the first 4, and then we'll get responses from the panel, and then we'll take the next 3. Okay, so I have, in order, Michael Richardson, Tally, Sam Hughes, and Mary C. Michael Richardson, can you briefly introduce yourself, ask a quick question, and then we'll get more on the table. Michael, just unmute yourself and you can speak. Michael may have left. Tally, you're up.
Okay, I hope you can still hear me because we've got a horrendous storm.
We can hear
It's
you
in
loud and
growth
clear.
right now, and you're about to get it. My question is kind of for all of you. What are the advantages and disadvantages of these options? The old Soviet weapons are old. However, the Ukrainians know how to use them. I know this came up with the fighter jets, for instance. They know how to fly the MiGs. They don't know how to fly some of the newer NATO ones. The new weapons, which are probably more powerful, are also much more technical to use. And they may or may not know how to use them. And I'm pretty sure a Zoom consultation isn't going to be very effective. What are the advantages and disadvantages of those two options?
Great. We're gonna let Del and or Jeff speak to that after we collect a few more. Sam Hughes, did you want to ask anything beyond the UN Security Council question?
No, that was all I had. I just wanted to see what the probability was of it getting kicked out of the Big Five, if ever, because it's done. I mean, it's done enough as it is to kind of go against what the UN sort of stands for. So I was just wondering.
Great. Jeff, we'll let Jeff weigh in on that. He also studies international organizations. Mary C., you had a couple of more technical questions related to weapon systems. Mary C.
Okay, this is actually her husband speaking.
Okay,
Bear
fire
with me.
away. What's your name?
Terry.
Go ahead, Terry.
I'm a retired Army Colonel, Special Operations, and served as NATO liaison in the World Bank on its Emergency Economic Recovery Program in the Balkans. Specifically, I was curious to know what, if any, checks and balances Russia might have on its nuclear arsenal. And then second, regarding the Switchblade, I was curious to know what type of munitions can be mounted on that Switchblade.
Great, thank you. Those are great questions. John Gilmore, you have the last question, then we'll get some responses. John Gilmore? Okay, John may have left. James
No,
Card.
I'm here.
Oh,
Here I
go
am.
ahead, John. Go ahead, John.
So, I had a question for Jeff. I really appreciated your discussion of the logic of nuclear exchanges. But so the question I have, it has to do with perceptions. I'm just curious what we know about how the Russians perceive this whole situation. Did they see that NATO expansion was really threatening their existence? Or did they see that what Ukraine was doing in moving out of their orbit as threatening their existence? What do we know about what the Russians really were thinking about all of these developments?
Great. Jeff, why don't you go first and we'll just go down the line. You
Sure.
can answer whatever questions you like and you can ignore the ones you don't like.
Oh, good. Okay. So then I'll just pass. No, I'm just. So I'll just go with John's question first on Russian perceptions, and I think it's always a little, I don't know, it's a little uncomfortable trying to get inside Putin's head for a couple of reasons. But in my mind, none of this is about NATO at all, and it's much more about Russian desire to have kind of Russian-aligned, Russian-friendly puppet regimes kind of around its border, and then this dream of kind of reconstituting something approximating the Soviet Union. So I think this this argument that the threat posed by NATO kind of set off this conflict is largely Russian propaganda. Not accusing you of anything, John, to try to justify this conflict, right? That you know that this is going to be their cause of wars. They feel like they're threatened by NATO, but I think the reality is probably more of an expansionist Russian goal and more about creating this kind of buffer zone. On checks and balances on Russian nuclear weapons, Russia has a advanced command and control system in terms of like checks and balances. Like, could Putin launch nuclear weapons if he wanted to? The answer is at least in doctrine, yes. Right, that this is Putin's decision to launch. It goes through the general staff, but it's his decision. But as in the United States case, the military would actually have to execute that decision. And in a situation where there are questions about the how clearly the leader is thinking, then there's at least the possibility that Some military may not be willing to execute that, but that's not the thing to count on, right? It's better to count on not having Putin give the launch order in the first place. I'll just mention on the question about weapons, that whether they require training and how that kind of factors into the calculus here. I'm sure Del will talk about this as well, but for much of this conflict, the NATO has been focused on providing military assistance that can be rapidly turned around and used quickly by the Ukrainian forces, because there's a sense that it's got to happen quickly or it might not happen at all. As the conflict kind of shifts into a more drawn out war of attrition kind of mode, then that opens up the possibility of providing weapon systems that do require more training. I saw that Ukraine had asked for a Patriot battery to provide a little bit of missile defense. It takes 100 trained US soldiers to operate a Patriot battery. They train for a year to operate that weapon system. That kind of thing is going to be kind of off the table because of the amount of training and expertise that's required. But there have been discussions about bringing Ukrainian troops into NATO countries to train and send them back. That stuff is very fraught because it goes into this risk of escalation issue. But as we shift from everything's got to happen in the next couple of days, or it might not happen at all, to we're going to be in a more long drawn out situation, then some of this stuff kind of comes back on the table.
Right. Del, do you want to address any of the questions that were put to you?
Sure, yes, I can address Tyler's question. So when it comes to the weapon systems and how advanced they are and can Ukrainians use them, that's actually one of the advantages of these more autonomous weapons being sent to Ukraine, that you don't need to know specifically how to use it. So when you have these different combat drones that we're used to seeing used by the United States, yes, you need to know specifically how to pilot these types of systems, how to identify your target correctly, know what you're going to hit, and then guide the drone to hit it. That's how a combat drone works. But when you have something like the Switchblade or other smaller munitions, these are autonomous systems that can fly itself. It can identify its target by itself. And then once you give it the go-ahead, it'll dive in and it will explode on its target. That is something that's relatively easy to use, and it would almost be akin to using, a remote control car. That is really, it would probably be harder to drive a remote control car than to simply input the characteristics you need and to launch a smaller munition. So the AI guidance, that's really changing how wars can be fought, because you don't need to be an expert in everything to know exactly how to launch those type of weapon systems. And then to the other question that was centered on the type of munitions that can be strapped onto these systems come with the munition already a part of it. That's what makes them a smaller munition and not a weaponized commercial drone. And on the warheads on these types of munitions can range in size, but for this, when you're talking about small loading munitions, you're probably going to get around somewhere between 0.5 kilogram to about 2 kilograms of the munition size. And that's going to be the damage that you get.
Great. Nathan and Kelly, do you want to weigh in on the questions that you like?
Nathan, go for it.
Yeah, just on whether NATO. I saw in the chat that there was a question on Ukraine joining NATO and relating to the other question about provoking Russia. Yeah, I think that the first panel that we had covered kind of the motives of Russia pretty well, and so just to add on to what Dr. Kaplow said, and to echo some of the first panel, I think that the motives of Putin and Russia are kind of, they include like the material and wanting more land and these resources, as well as the reputational and wanting to expand like the Russian world. And so, yeah, I just think that you can't place too much emphasis on any one factor, including the one that is this kind of center of the Russian propaganda of kind of NATO enlargement, although it is a debate in the international relations.
Yeah, and I would just add, and I would add to these too, that this also, is identitarian, right? And so Russia, Putin and people in his orbit, in his circle, have said things like Ukraine is not even a real state, and suggested that Ukrainian national identity is not genuine or homegrown, that it's kind of this accident of history and Western interference. And so when the administration has said things like, we will denazify Ukraine, it's really that we will eliminate Ukrainian national identity, which has been growing in recent years and decades through the revitalization of the Ukrainian language learning, education, history, culture, etc. And so, and that triggers for us then, looking at the at international responses and looking at international law, possibly violations, right, of the 1948 Genocide Convention, that Russia may be perpetrating genocide. Now, this isn't, I would say, as easily recognizable as genocide for many people. It doesn't quite have that ethnic animus, let's say, that we might have seen in Rwanda or during the Shoah and the Holocaust, right? Because you have ethnic Russians and Russian speakers and ethnic Ukrainians, and also a range of other people. Ukraine is a multi-ethnic, multiracial, multicultural society who are all being assailed, right? And so you can say, well, it's really hard to prove that it's really genocide per se. But that's if you ignore that, that genocide is a set of acts, which is not limited to killing, that it targets for the destruction in whole or in part a racial, ethnic, religious, or national group. And so it really is the civic nation here that it is being assailed, right? That it is Ukraine as a nation, Ukrainian national identity, that is at risk. And so that's why you have the chief prosecutor of the ICC, Karim Khan, including genocide among the suspected crimes, including crimes against humanity and war crimes, which had been part of the existing probe that was opened in 2016. I will add just an answer to a question from Thomas about will we see NATO buildup and provision of additional forces because of revelations of serious crimes, or what are likely to be determined as serious crimes. We have to be circumspect to a degree as analysts, right? And there really should be. And so, I am not a guns and bombs person. I leave that to Del and to Jeff. But this whole idea of we don't want to escalate, I think escalation is going to happen. Is just the question is when it is going to happen. Putin is a very honest leader in many ways. He says he's going to do something and then he does it. And so he didn't say, I am here to take the Donbass. He said, I am here to take Ukraine. And so whether we wait until Ukraine has been decimated and until a NATO member like Poland has been attacked for then to have, the full-on engagement, there's going to be an engagement regardless. I note also, and this is where things get complicated, that the Genocide Convention, which I mentioned, which Nathan mentioned, I don't know if you picked up on the nuance in the title as he stated it. It is the 1948 Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. This particular crime requires states to proactively prevent, right? And so that's why you have the doctrine of responsibility to protect. That's why you have intervention in places like Rwanda with the UN peacekeepers. That's why you have NATO and allies getting involved in the Balkans, right? During that conflict, that there was a responsibility to protect, right? There is an obligation implied for the international community to intervene. And the fact that we are not intervening to the extent that we could poses a serious problem. And even from the part of the US government, you will have noted some European leaders, and including Zelensky, have said genocide. The Biden administration is not prepared to say that because it implies actions, including an up to military intervention. And there is just not the interest nor the appetite at present to do that. And that will likely mean that we will see tragedy upon tragedy until we finally intervene, as was the case in the former Yugoslavia and with the Balkans crisis. And Clinton said that one of the greatest regrets of his presidency was, or if not the greatest regret of his presidency, was the US's delayed intervention.
Fantastic. We have 13 more minutes, and that means one more round of questions. So we'll please ask your questions succinctly and clearly, and then we'll get back to the panel for one more round. So James Card, a portion of your question was addressed, but I don't know if you want to follow up or ask a different question. James? Nice to see your go ahead, go for it. It's good to see you again, James.
Thanks, Mike. Good to see you too. I just wanted to follow up to the idea of what could constitute a attack that would provoke NATO. I mean, I think in this current context, we're all catastrophist and fearing the worst, but there's also the possibility of death by 1,000 paper cuts. And I think of possibly any microaggression that might seek to undermine the collective resolve of NATO allies to have a clear understanding of what defines an attack against one that could lead to an attack against all. I think particularly about cyber attacks on infrastructure of any allied members of the alliance. So what are the risks of perhaps a more strategic approach by Putin to undermine the overall deterrent effect that NATO has become? Thank you.
Great, thanks. Nathan Colvin. Nathan? Nathan may no longer be with us. Bob Hinger, you had two questions, I think, Bob. Bob Hinger, are you still with us? People ask these great questions and then they leave us. Okay, Sam Passman. Sam?
Yeah, hello everyone. So I guess my question was, and this may have already been addressed, at the start of the invasion, there was some talk about, for example, training Ukrainians on weapons platforms like the A-10 Warthog attack aircraft, the M1 Abrams. At the time, people said no, because, this needs to happen, aid needs to happen in the next couple of hours, or it's not going to happen at all. Ukraine may fall. Now that the war has, obviously failed with the, initial Russian attack, the war is becoming more stalemated. Does it really make sense to train Ukrainians for months on those weapons, because they could win them the war, but does it make sense to pull them out of the line for that long?
Great. I have two more questions here. One from Rachel Zalowski.
Yeah. I just can't help but feel really negative about what's going on. And I was just wondering, is there cause to be positive? I just don't see how Putin will let Ukraine win. I feel like if Putin has no other option, then he would totally resort to extreme measures. And I also don't know if I really see Russia being punished for its crimes. If it wins, what can we really do? And if it loses still, it also has all these prominent positions on various IOs, and I don't know, I'm just tell me something positive, or just tell me how it's really going to be. I just want to kind of maybe have more realistic expectations.
I think Dave Puster, you have a question that's closely related. Dave, do you want to go?
Yeah, I just had a question. I mean, just to kick off the third portion on international law, I think it was addressed that it's very hard to convict people on the crimes themselves, because you have to get physical custody of them. And other world leaders have been brought to trial, and considering the enormity of the atrocities, do you think that it's possible to bring Putin himself to trial? Over.
And Scott B., you have the final question, and then we'll give our panelists one more round. Scott B.
Okay, so my belief is that America has more leverage in this thing with Russia and can leverage Russia more than anybody in the world. So my question is, what more could the USA do to arm the Ukrainians and cut off the Russian energy industry?
Great set of questions. Let's go reverse order this time. Kelly and Nathan, why don't you all go first?
I can quickly say something about possibility of prosecuting Putin. So the first difficulty, even before obtaining physical custody of Putin, would be first examining the evidentiary base that there are crimes being committed, and then second, connecting those crimes up the chain of command to Putin. So any court of law would have to show very strictly that senior military leaders and Putin knew about and were responsible for the crimes that we're committing, that they weren't just being committed by the soldiers on the ground. And then, as you mentioned, the physical custody part is obviously difficult if Putin doesn't leave Russia. And so just to talk very quickly about other cases of this, with looking at the International Criminal Court, Omar al-Bashir of Sudan was one state leader who was charged with atrocities by the International Criminal Court. And thus far, no ICC members have been willing to comply with the Rome Statute and deliver him into custody. South Africa, Chad, and Kenya were some of the countries that refused to do so. And other national leaders have evaded the court as well. Yeah, Professor Zvobgo, some of the other questions.
Yeah, so exactly right. All ICC members, of which there are 123, have an obligation, should an ICC fugitive be found on their territory, to turn them over. Multiple countries have refused to do so for multiple people. Also, there is the risk, when you charge a leader, that they will engage in victim intimidation. So no witnesses, no case, right? And so that's what we saw in Kenya with Uhuru Kenyatta, the president, and his deputy, William Ruto, who incidentally were running against each other for president. And then when the ICC investigation opened, they decided to form a unity ticket. And one of the planks of their platform was not cooperating with the ICC, and they were elected. And so that was massively popular at home, and it gained them the top jobs in the country. And so public sentiment can definitely shape compliance and non-compliance. Certainly, in this whole conversation, we've assumed that Putin will retain power forever. That may not be the case. He might, cease to be useful to his oligarchs and to members of the military, though they are conservative, right? So this idea in comparative politics of there's the electorate, right, which doesn't really matter in an autocracy because you don't get to meaningfully affect the outcome. But then there's also this idea of the selectorate, right? The key people in key positions that keep leaders in power. And should there be changes there and Putin be removed, because people aren't getting to enjoy their yachts, or because some higher ups maybe travel and are now facing a UJ case, a universal jurisdiction case in a neighboring country, and maybe Putin's not coming to the rescue, that there could be an overthrow or a coup or an autogolpe, like a self coup by members of the current regime. It might seem far-fetched, but I like to always say it's impossible until it happens, right? 1992 did not have to be the year that Mandela was released from prison and that serious negotiations for a free and democratic South Africa were to happen, right? 1996 did not have to be the year when the Guatemalan internal armed conflict ended. And likewise, 99 did not have to be the year that Indonesia acquiesced to a referendum, a UN-backed referendum by East Timorese to cease its occupation and military intervention. And so it's totally possible. But going to the question about, can we give you something to be optimistic about? I mean, absolutely not, at least from my perspective, because even if you get justice, right, if we're able to have legal accountability, criminal accountability, that will be, just that'll be in response to horrific violence. And I think as Americans, we need to resist the temptation to be forward-looking and to be looking for a bright side in all of this. War is horror, and we should be channeling our frustrations, our convictions, our resources into ending the conflict and to beginning the long road to justice. And accountability, which is what we've talked about, is just one piece. We haven't even talked about compensation for damages, reparations, psychological counseling for people who have been, bombarded now for, we're going to the second month of this, right? Like there is, I don't have an optimistic story to tell at present. And I think it's important that we manage expectations. And that's coming from me. And I'm usually the the optimistic person, but even I want us to be chaste in this moment because the moment requires it.
Thanks, Kelly. Del?
Yeah, I'll just be quick. I think I agree with Professor Z. It's not really there's not really a lot of bright signs in this conflict to see, especially because even regardless if Ukraine is able to, regain, remain independent, whether that be with just part of its land and maybe the east is ceded to Russia, or if it's able to keep all of its land, Russia is just flattening the entire country right now. And that's a lot to build up afterward. I will say though, one way to look at this conflict, and Professor Kaplow may have a different view on this, but right now, unless and until NATO involves itself, this is really going to be an economic war between NATO and its allies and Russia. And that's really going to be how Russia can be stopped, is whether the United States can muster enough economic pressure to either get oligarchs to oust Putin or to just have Putin say, okay, our economy can't take this anymore. The weapons that we're giving them, like the Switchblade, those are really trying to help the Ukrainians stay up until that economic pressure is able to work. And I don't think unless NATO decides to involve itself, the military conflict is not really going to matter in terms of stopping Russians, no matter what the Ukrainians do. And I fear no matter how many Russians that Ukrainians are able to bleed, it's not really going to matter for Putin.
Thanks, Del. Jeff, you land this plane. I'll make a few final comments and then we'll all go have our dinner.
All right, I'll be quick. Here's my positive take, my optimistic take. So I think Russia absolutely can still lose this war. And in a very important way, Russia has already lost this war in the sense that its political aims are pretty hard to imagine coming true, right? This idea that it was going to waltz in and have this new Ukrainian state that was a puppet regime of Russia, that seems very unlikely to happen. And Russia has revealed itself to have kind of a weaker military, and there's a big debate about this, but weak enough that this is reputationally damaging to Russia. So I think in pretty much every way, this has gone very poorly for Russia. And that's the positive side, right? That militarily, this has been a disaster on the Russian end. And Ukraine is absolutely in a position that it could win a real military victory here. How that ends, that's the big question, right? Because we're out of time, I think I'll just respond very briefly to something that Kelly said about the kind of inevitability of escalation. I'll just take this opportunity to disagree a little bit and say that I don't think escalation is inevitable in the same way that Kelly does, while it's certainly a possibility, right? And that's kind of what I was trying to get at in my presentation. But I want to be clear that intervention in this conflict is really nothing like intervention in a situation like Rwanda, in the sense that it would involve sending thousands of troops, shooting down Russian aircraft, basically a full-scale war in the largest country in Europe. And this is not a good thing, both for the risk of nuclear escalation and global thermonuclear war, but it's not necessarily a good thing for the people in these places either, right? And escalating this war has really serious consequences, not just in Ukraine, but elsewhere. And we should be, I think, appropriately hesitant about recommending that kind of an approach.
Chaste, sober, hesitant. I think those are the right ideas to land on. I'd like to end by thanking these four scholars for coming together with us tonight and having this conversation. I know I learned enormously from each of them, so thank you. I really appreciate you taking the time to do this. I know this is a very tough time for the semester. I also want to say that it's great. I know that we're only on Zoom, but it is great to get together not only with our students and my colleagues, but also with so many alums. It's great to recognize names and faces in the chat and on the Zoom screen. So thank you for coming back to William and Mary and sharing your ideas. It's almost like you never left the seminar room. So until we have our 6th conversation, which should be sometime in the next 2 weeks, please have a good evening, and thanks again for coming out.
Thank you.